Stories are your secret weapon. Hello, Malcolm here. Welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 408, and this is part 13 of our series, Your Voice Matters, focused on tips for new and inexperienced speakers. And today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the use of stories in our teaching and preaching. And the idea for this comes from my friend Stefan Wolmarans, who sent me this tip, and he sent it in a voice memo, so I'm going to paraphrase what he said. But in essence, what Stefan is saying is Jesus was very good at telling stories. Just look at his parables. Stories stick in the memory when information does not. Or perhaps we could say that stories help information to stick. Stories are the thing that are that extra bit of glue that help us to get our point across, and so that it stays with people and helps them not while they're listening, just at that moment in time, but for the days and weeks and months ahead. So let's explore how we can tell stories well and why they matter. So firstly, why do stories matter in our teaching and preaching? Well, given the billions and billions of pounds or dollars or whatever currency you have spent by all the moviegoers across the globe, they spent on television subscriptions, on books and similar material, we probably don't need to justify the significance of stories and storytelling. The truth is that stories, they just simply stick. At least good stories do. For example, I could tell you some information, or I could give you an instruction. For example, I could say, paying attention is important. Is that true? Yes. Is it helpful? Yes. Will you remember it after this recording is over? Maybe, maybe not. You may not feel compelled to pay attention to my urging you to pay attention. Rather than just telling you that paying attention is important, I could instead tell you a story. I could tell you the story, which I won't tell you in all the detail now, but the story about when my son, when he was young, was hospitalized as an emergency. Now, we weren't sure exactly what the problem was, but I paid attention as I sat next to his bed hour after hour after hour, watching his body. He was hallucinating. He was in a really bad way. Doctors were very worried about him. And suddenly, as I sat there paying attention, I noticed some blotches on one of his legs. So I called the nurse, they called the doctor, who came running, and they ran off, and then they ran back, and they pumped him full of antibiotics to treat what was now clearly meningococcal septicemia. It's quite possible that my attentiveness might have saved his life, or at least his limbs, because if you delay treatment, you can lose a limb or even die. So you might not remember my admonition to pay attention, but you might remember the story about my son, especially if I fleshed it out, of course, in a proper teaching or preaching scenario. You'd remember the story, and then you stand a better chance of being convinced of the significance of paying attention and applying it to your own life. Now let's talk about how to tell a story. First of all, some do-nots. Some do-nots would be, try not to read the story, like you've got it on your note in your notes here and you're reading the story, It's death to story to read them. Try not to read them. If it's a story of your own, you should know it anyway. You don't need notes, really. Maybe there's the odd word you could highlight, but you know it because it's your story. If it's a story about somebody else or a different situation, then practice it until you don't need notes. Stories are meaningful when they connect on an emotional level, and a lack of eye contact, if we're looking down and reading, works against that end. If you're watching the video, you can see behind me a number of things that belong to me. I could tell you a story about any one of those objects without having to look at notes. I could tell you a story about the class picture on the wall. I could tell you a story about the book on top of the piano with the facsimiles of Bible manuscripts from the Chester Beatty Museum in Dublin. I could tell you a story about the gargoyle over that shoulder. I could tell you a story about the Irish harp on the top. I could tell you a story about the ostrich egg from South Africa. I can tell you those stories because they're my stories. We don't need to read them from a book. So try not to do that when you're telling a story. Secondly, another don't share unnecessary detail. I heard someone tell a moving story recently about how God answered their prayers. Unfortunately, they included lots of irrelevant detail in the story, like the weather and all kinds of things like that. The story was then too long, its effect was diluted, and unfortunately the impact was lost. So tell the story, your story clearly, tell it succinctly. Otherwise, you have too much in there. It's a bit like mixing up 3 lots of jigsaw puzzle pieces into one box, and then you've got to sort them all out before you can figure out what the jigsaw really is. And it's confusing and it takes too long, and then you've lost the impact. Those are some don'ts. What about some do's for telling stories? Firstly, make sure your story has the classic beginning, middle, and end. Usually there's a setup, a context, or a cause. There's a struggle in the middle, obstacles, problems, or confusion. And then at the end, there's a resolution, an answer, a victory, a lesson learned. A beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what sets a story apart from an anecdote. Secondly, tie the story to your scriptural point. If you're preaching from a text in the scriptures here, make sure your story is actually relevant to that, not that you love your story, you want to tell it. We tell stories that are hopefully entertaining, but we don't tell the stories to entertain. We tell the stories such that the text, the truth about Jesus, about God, about the Holy Spirit, that will come out more clearly. So make sure you really have tied together your story and your point. Make sure it connects. Thirdly, take your audience with you as you tell your story. In other words, don't rush the story. There's a tendency to do this sometimes, especially when it's your story and you know the story because you know where it's going. And so you don't give time for your audience to process what's going on while it's going on. So give it enough time. Don't stretch it out, but take your time in the story. You know your story. You know the emotional connection. And that's not so strong for you now, but your audience need to process their feelings of the story as you go along, as they absorb it. They need time for their emotions to stay in step with your story. So take your time in telling your story. And finally, practice. Practice your story. Tell the story to yourself on a video or on audio and listen to yourself again. Where are the pauses needed? If I'm telling that story about my son in the hospital, I'm going to say I was paying attention and I sat there hour after hour after hour, and then suddenly, and I'm going to pause. I noticed something. Pause. A blotch on his leg that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. Pause. We need pauses so that people understand there's a pace to the story and there's something dramatic going on. So practice your story. Just to wrap up, I have recorded on the topic of stories and anecdotes a few times. So I'm linking these on my website and the show notes there. So go there if you want to see Teaching Tip 230, How to Use Stories. That's from 4 years ago. From 6 years ago, Why You Need Keynote Stories. And from 7 years ago, episode 96, How to Reenact a Story, which I recommend that one. It's quite fun. And again, from 7 years ago, Teaching Tip 90, what's the difference between an anecdote and a story? And a similar one, Anecdotes versus Stories, 8 years ago. All the links are in the notes, which are on the website. You'll find them there. Stories, they're like a secret weapon. Stories open hearts. They drive points home. Even many non-believers know the stories of Jesus because they're so powerful. So don't make the mistake of thinking that only natural storytellers can tell stories. It's a learned skill, and it's one that you can develop. And I would suggest if you want to be effective in teaching and preaching, you must develop it to the best of your ability. So let me ask you a question. How do you feel about telling stories? Do you feel intimidated? Do you feel like it's something that only actors can do? I believe it isn't. It truly is not. However, how do you feel about it? Why not incorporate a story? Let me give you this challenge to incorporate a story into your next lesson, and let me know how it goes. What did you learn from doing that? What kind of impact did it have? How could you do it better next time? Please add your comments on this week's topic. We learn best when we're learning in community, so leave your comment where we can all see it. And do consider joining us for AIM UK and Ireland. We're currently doing New Testament survey. New Testament interpretation starts later this spring. You can find the links you'll find the information on the website from the links in the show notes and on the screen. If you have any questions about the Bible, drop me an email. And if you'd like a copy of my free ebook on spiritual disciplines, then sign up for my newsletter at the website, malcolmcox.org. Please pass this link on to anybody who might benefit. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. And remember, at all times, when you're telling your stories and when you're not, keep calm and carry on teaching. Take care. And God bless.